Many times in a crisis or a perceived crisis, sometimes we have to remind ourselves, is it a crisis, an issue, or a situation?
Welcome to the Smart Talk series, the show for professionals who want strategies, tips, and real talk about all things PR, marketing, and social media. Your host is Melissa Vella-Williamson, an award-winning, accredited, and nationally recognized PR pro and communication thought leader. And now your host, Melissa Vella-Williamson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Smart Talk series. I'm Melissa Vella-Williamson. Today, I'm joined by Chris Talley. For more than 30 years, Chris has led communication programs from the front row, most recently as a Fortune 100 Chief Communications Officer at USAA. Throughout the years, Chris has led teams at USAA, AT&T, and Lockheed Martin, and dozens of others while at Fleishman Hillard, one of the world's most prestigious public relations agencies. Today, he leads Talley Communication Strategies, volunteers in the community, and devotes time to supporting students seeking PR careers. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, how you doing, MVW?
I'm doing great. Even better that you're here. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks. It's going to be a lot of fun. Congratulations on your podcast.
Well, thanks for being my first guest on with me. It's certainly a journey, and I'm looking forward to a fun adventure with you today.
Awesome.
So you've had an amazing communications experience and background. Tell us a little bit more about your life's journey in PR and comm and your current role and what you're doing today.
Well, let's see. I could go all the way back to Baylor or even high school when I was the editor of the high school newspaper. I always loved writing and storytelling and editing, and certainly the function and the tactics associated with how we communicate with one another have been central to relationships and mankind since the formation of mankind. So it's always been a joy to be in the communications business. And through the years, worked at big corporate brands and aerospace PR, going to space shuttle launches and commercial satellite launches. And then through the years, series of mergers and acquisitions and the reassembly of AT&T when Ed Whitaker was putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, and working for the last 12 years at one of the most iconic brands, quite frankly, in the world, USAA, and taking care of the men and women who defend this great country. So fortunate to be a part of a lot of things, and now giving back to the San Antonio community, visiting with students around the country who want to get into communications and doing a little bit of consulting.
That's incredible. That's awesome. Your background and your path is one we could all really learn from and follow for sure. You've done a lot. Is there a favorite time or a favorite type of PR that you've done?
Well, I've always kind of enjoyed mergers and acquisitions. It would be fun to tell my wife I'm going into the office after church, and she would say, well, when will you be back? And I would say, I don't know. And could be Tuesday, could be Wednesday, could be a week. So those are always thrilling times. I'm not necessarily, you don't want to have to deal with a crisis, but preparing for crises and the inevitability that we all face, either as humans or entities, where you're going to have to run into some things that you might have to address from time to time. Nobody's perfect, so it's certainly inevitable. I certainly have enjoyed that, and preparing in advance is an awful lot of fun. And the importance of internal communications, particularly in this past year, has just been reinforced time and time again. So think about, how are companies going to maintain the cultures that they had pre-COVID when the workforce comes back, but not necessarily all the way back to the way it once was? At USA, we were a heavy face-to-face organization. The culture was very much face-to-face. And what percent of employees actually want to come back into the office? It's probably, in many companies, more than half of their employees want to stay home. So the communications function gets to poke its nose into every single thing. There are no off-limit boundaries, and always enjoyed being able to be a part of everything that's happening within an organization.
That's really right on. I think what's important, what you said is, we get to poke our nose into every piece. I know when I talk to students, and I've really enjoyed a silver lining of the pandemic for me has been talking to students really across the country. At this point, I'm starting to build a map and put a little dot on every state I've been to. What I notice is if giving them a symbol or telling a story helps them understand the career a little bit better. So I always liken myself to, we do have to ask the hard questions. We have to be advisors. If you've ever seen the movie Pinocchio by Disney, I think of myself sometimes as Jiminy Cricket. And it does feel like you're literally poking your nose into some things and asking the tough questions. And you're not always a fan favorite inside of an organization. And good client relationship, they'll value that. But sometimes when you're an employee, it can feel a little different.
That's right. But in order for us to provide our best counsel, support our clients, whether they be inside of a company or from a consulting perspective, if you don't have all of the information, you can't provide your best thinking. And so I always challenge myself and challenge our clients with, what didn't I ask you? What do you wish that I wouldn't ask you? And just have to be incredibly curious and almost unwilling to be satisfied that you know it all. So that curiosity and that desire to just kind of dig and dig and dig, like our friends who are journalists, is certainly our responsibility and part of the fun.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can think like an investigative journalist, you're going to do pretty well in issues management, crisis communication. And that's really what I would love to dig into with you today. And you gave us a great setup for that. Is crisis communication is certainly a specialty in the PR industry. What I've seen over the 17 years I've been in the field is that there are some pros who love that, rise to that challenge, find it, your point earlier, a little thrilling, and others that would rather have nothing to do with it. It's very stressful for them. It can be very emotionally taxing. And here comes the pandemic. And all of a sudden, just about every communicator was dealing in some form or fashion with crisis communication when it hit our country, hit their area. And it seemed like an acute issue that maybe would have a time frame around it. And then just, I don't know how you feel, and I'd love to hear your viewpoint, but it seems like now just an ongoing issues management situation. But what has your experience been in crisis communication and then crisis comm during the pandemic?
Yeah, at USA, we had scenarios built out for about 200 or so situations that the company could face, ranging from an unfortunate incident on a campus to cybersecurity breaches, of course. We are in the insurance and natural disaster business, and so you prepare for those as well. And what we found is that communicating about an event, be it a crisis, is relatively straightforward. So getting communications to 35,000 employees about how to be safe, how to secure the data that you operate on your machines, and what the company is going to do to give you peace of mind about benefits and how we're going to address this pandemic was essential so that the employees could focus on members. And so event-based crises seem to be a little bit more black and white because there's an urgency to it. There's a need to tell it like it is and to understand that the facts will probably evolve. So you're never going to get the story entirely accurate, but you can set the foundation for the communications cadence, the level of transparency that you should have already committed to as a leadership team so that you're not making those decisions in the moment. And then being straightforward about how often updates would be forthcoming. So that's been reinforced through time. What is tougher is some of the more grayer issues. So the country has been through quite a few divisive matters over the past several years. And so staying grounded and focused on who you are and why you exist can help you navigate those times so that you're not trying to create new communications or be something that you're not in the face of an unfortunate societal issue, for example.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that. A lot of my advice for organizations of any kind, really, even for people in their personal brands, because that was challenging and it's still challenging today, is to focus on what really matters, being a source of optimism, sharing clear, relatable communication, and doubling down on what you stand for, your scope, the cultural values of your organization. Or if you have that personal brand presence in the community, what you stand for, what are those pillars?
Many times in a crisis or a perceived crisis, sometimes we have to remind ourselves, is it a crisis, an issue, or a situation? And how you respond may be similar regardless of how you classify that. But, for example, that was really critical for us at USA to pre-identify with the board of directors what matters they could expect to receive communications on, what matters they should be involved in actively managing or aggressively governing, and then when are those things that they would be informed on. So it can vary from time to time, but I kind of like that idea of thinking about an issue versus a crisis versus a situation.
Yeah. Well, I studied for my accreditation in PR during the pandemic. So I have my little vocabulary textbook near me, often just because sometimes when you're actually living the work, you may not remember all the terminology. And so that idea of the event you were right on, it's the triggering event, right? What triggered all this action or chaos? And I think over the course of the pandemic months that we've had since COVID-19 hit, we saw a lot of organizations, perhaps they did the right thing at the beginning with communication and explaining how COVID has impacted them and their response to it. But then they kind of started creeping scope a little bit or not being as transparent. Those are some of the immediate things I thought about when I saw a lot of changes and getting close to mistakes that communicators were making. What kind of mistakes did you see organizations or communicators make during the pandemic months?
I wonder if it's mistakes or if it was one of the things that I think can be challenging in scenarios for communicators is that everybody thinks they're a communicator and or has commentary on the communications. And so take the George Floyd tragedy, for example. I knew that we needed to communicate on that and that our CEO needed to be the one to communicate with our employees. The speed at which we did or did not communicate, the message that we did communicate, it felt like 35,000 different points of view coming to me with regard to that communications. And so sometimes what will get muddled is not so much a mistake as it is who has the decision authority or the decision rights to make a decision. In that particular case, was it the corporate responsibility team? Was it the diversity and ethics team? Was it the CEO? Was it HR? And the answer to the question is dependent on who you asked. So that's why I like to do crisis planning in advance and predetermine as much as you can so that when you face the inevitability of a crisis, you've already made the decisions that need to be made. Legal has already weighed in and provided their input, and you're acting versus trying to decide.
No, that's a great point. I think as communicators, it's important for us to realize and evaluate our situations, knowing that we don't have full control. Some of the messaging we need to put out there. To your point, I had seen an example sometime over the pandemic, 12 months. And what I'll say is what I've noticed with people, I do a lot of people watching. That's part of my forecasting, kind of monitoring the environment and imagining what may be happening with public sentiment on different topics. Masks, for example, right? The beginning of the pandemic, we understood a little bit about what CDC had to say about masks, and then but it seemed optional and maybe just a cautionary tactic, and then it became mandatory, and then it became political. I mean, the way we felt just about a simple face mask has changed so much, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen people become more and more exhausted over time, and that's where I'm seeing more emerging just internal employee issues, people issues, staff issues, that they're kind of hitting this emotional wall or being stacked up so much emotionally with everything that's just being disrupted or a little bit harder in this time where they just kind of pop off at some point. And one thing I saw online was a colleague had posted a screenshot of a person that they assumed was the communicator for an organization who made a post that was pretty flippant. I think it was trying to be cute around our Texas snowstorm. And it was from ERCOT. And there wasn't much bandwidth from Texans who were without power and then water for some of them on top of that to see a tongue-in-cheek comment on social. Make sure you unplug the appliance that you bought during the pandemic to save some energy right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that just seemed very cold. And I took it as someone trying to be humorous, but I reminded my colleague, hey, I did it privately, right? We want to praise in public and criticize privately. In a direct message, I just reminded them that we really shouldn't identify someone and screenshot their information and post it out there on social, because that could be dangerous for them. And that person responded back very positively and said, I didn't even think about it. I was just so upset and I'll take it down right now. But those people problems have just seemed to emerge. And we have those moments of upset or vulnerability, and it can cause issues for our organizations and clients. And so I've noticed more people problems. Have you noticed anything during these last few months?
Well, I think the biggest issue is we're all together with our families almost in an unprecedented fashion, the amount of time we've spent with one another. And for my wife and I, our children are older and out of the house, but managing the household affairs and doing your job, and then also being a great spouse and great parent and great child, there's just an enormous amount of pressure, and there's not a lot of individual time. So it's going to be interesting to see what our psyche is like when we have the freedom to get out and about again, and then what routines have been forever changed. And I don't think we'll know. It's probably going to take a year or so to really fully understand all of those implications. But the amount of togetherness, I mean, when humans get together, humans are humans. So
People are people. Yeah, that was one of my favorite lines in the Muppets Take Manhattan movies. People is peoples. Rats are rats.
people listening in are getting all this insightful information. People are people.
Right. And we do have our limits. I'll say that this has felt like I've been in a pressure cooker of just issues and problems. And typically in a normal year for my work, it's proactive public relations, it's proactive strategies and planning and execution. And so it's more of a game of offense. And when you're in a crisis situation that moves into an ongoing issues management situation, it does feel like you're playing a whole lot more defense. Maybe that makes people defensive, Chris. What do you think?
Could be. I think as a good practice to bring into those situations is, again, that declaring what the timing of communication is going to be. And you could even kind of set like my wife and I, there's times when I know I can approach her and say, hey, what do you want to do about dinner tonight? Or what are our plans this weekend? And then there's times when it's clearly evident to me that this is no time to engage. So just keep on moving. And so those same kinds of rules can take place within the workplace with regard to how and when decisions are made and when is the best time for people to interact with other people.
No, absolutely. I talk to my children even often. I have a son who's 6 and a daughter who's 11. I'm trying to train them early to read the room and read my facial expressions and don't stick your hand in the bee's nest when the bees are going crazy.
Yes.
And because just as communicators too, we can get caught up in checking things off our list and keeping things moving and not reading that room and making sure that we're in line with the timing and how people are doing. You had mentioned earlier that USAAs had went from traditional in-person workplace, an amazing campus, to everyone going remote. And they've been wonderfully supportive of their employees about that. But they just announced, I think it was yesterday, how they're going to look at moving forward with more employees coming back in person. And it will be interesting for them to assess and work with their employees to see who can stay hybrid, who wants to stay fully remote, who wants to stay back in office, because that's where they're more successful. So I think meeting our employees in their reality is going to be a great step forward in our restoration and as a community, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. A year ago at this time, you'd start off every meeting with maybe 5 minutes or so of checking in to see how your colleagues are doing, what their home situation was. And there was real intentionality with regard to really taking the time to be purposeful about connecting and understanding people on more of a emotional basis. And what I've observed, and I'm guilty of it myself, is that we did that extensively at the beginning, just like we did family Zooms very religiously at the beginning. And then as time has gone on, that's begun to waver a little bit. So as we move out of the pandemic and back to whatever the new norm is going to be, being very intentional about the routines that you want to maintain as non-negotiables is going to be critical, both as individuals and organizations.
Yeah, there was a lot of learning that we could take away from this. And you're right about that assessment. Even for those who are into event planning, we are not just going to be able to turn back on fully in person, even if all of your event attendees were vaccinated. There's still a level of anxiety that I'm hearing and seeing from people, and articles coming out about people not being prepared for returning back to all this in-person time. So that's a good point you make there. This can all be a lot. And for communication pros, some of us sit in a social media camp and all of a sudden they're doing more crisis communication, messaging. Some are in advertising. That's really been disrupted and changed. And they're a little more afraid in some cases to put together campaigns with, I would say, an increased sensitivity from our community. So a lot of challenging situations. How have you've been in extremely challenging situations in the organizations you've been, the teams you've led, the categories you focused on. What were some of the most challenging situations you have faced in your career?
Well, many times those challenges have stemmed from situations where, for whatever reason, you or the team kind of loses your way or doesn't pause long enough to say, why do we exist? What do we want to be known for? And to what end? And so if you just take things back to the fundamentals, you can typically succeed. It's when we let emotions get the best of us, or when we misjudge a situation, or somebody else perhaps causes us to think something that is not a crisis is a crisis. And so many times being confident to be the educator and to be the one that says, time out, the sun is going to go down tonight and it'll come back up tomorrow. The world does not revolve around us. I know this feels like it might be the end of the world, but it is not. And let's just take a step back from this. And so most of the times it's been overreaction, could be to headlines, could be to a question in an all-employee meeting where the leader was challenged, any number of situations like that where it feels like a crisis in the moment and it's not. And then the other ones really have to do with people and how they behave and understanding that your integrity is everything and that we're always on. And so when somebody violates core values or does something inappropriate, having the courage and confidence to do what's right and take the appropriate action.
Ooh, let's talk about that. That's no, it just got me excited because reputation management, trying to lead our leaders, is something that some professionals struggle with. And I know that you are excellent at it. So what would you advise us regarding reputation management? How does it play into all of this?
One of the ways that I've had success in this is really helping people understand the difference between brand and reputation. So brand, we have control over. How do we look? How do we sound? How do we think? How do we perform? And whether it's a restaurant, your church, the gym that you work out at, and the nonprofit that you serve on or support, how individuals feel about you or that entity is your reputation in their eyes. And so I've always focused everybody on understanding the difference between brand and reputation, and then taking it to who are we, what do we stand for, what do we believe in, and what is our personality. And when you have those fundamentals in place, many times it makes whatever you're trying to get a leader to do or not do pretty easy to convince them that your point of view is accurate because it's of service to the mission or the purpose of the organization versus something that's individual. So some CEOs love to speak and like to be in public. Others do not. But whether you enjoy speaking in public or not, or vice versa, if you're the CEO of a company, you have a responsibility to communicate to the audiences that give you permission to both operate and to succeed. So it's really been more a matter of education and doubling down on purpose and mission and working it from there.
Well, I think that sounds all very smart and good, and you're absolutely correct and right. And I think that what I have experienced, well, I know what I've experienced is that there are some times where I advise communicators when they can't get their organizational leadership to take the right actions is to watch and manage their own personal brand and reputation.
That's right.
Sometimes you can help be the change, and sometimes you have to make a change. And I know I've had to make some tough decisions where I had to really think about my integrity and my reputation and opt to serve that for the long haul versus doing what I was told to do because that made a supervisor happy when I knew it wasn't the right action to take.
Right,
so I just want to point that out too for you communication pros, that you may be in situations like Chris is saying, where you are giving that advice and you are giving that counsel and they're not listening or taking the right actions. that you might have to make some tough decisions, particularly if you're in public relations, so that your reputation is solid and that integrity goes with you as you move from opportunity to opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. Very nice.
There you go. There's your piece of advice. Take that. I'll invoice you later. So
There you go.
wonderful. Well, so this has been, you sound very cool and collected and calm under pressure. But for those of us who are a little more emotionally based or wear our hearts on our sleeves, how can we manage stress of communication when it's topics that are uncomfortable, awkward, we don't want to talk about, or could be damaging for our organizations?
Well, you talked about your children earlier, and you're really teaching them about the importance of EQ. And so one of the things that I've tried to do through the years is, okay, well, what do I think we should do about this situation, and have a point of view, a strategy, an approach that addresses either the opportunity or the situation. And then what role does the individual who I need to make the decision, if it's not myself, what role are they in? What pressures are they under? What vantage point are they looking at this from? And take myself out of the equation and put myself in their shoes so that I can look at it from their perspective. So if it's the president of a business unit and the situation is a customer service issue, and you want to acknowledge the mistake and talk about the steps that are being taken to address it so that it doesn't happen in the future and that we learn from it, to me, that sounds like a very straightforward approach to pretty straightforward situation. But if I'm the business unit president, I might be a little bit ashamed of what happened or unwilling to acknowledge what happened, for example. So really putting yourselves in two shoes. One is the shoes of the individual or individuals who need to make the decision and or deliver the news. And then, of course, what's best for the organization. And typically you can get to a pretty good resolution when you put yourself in both of those shoes and help counsel your clients through whatever it is you need to navigate.
Well, that's great. But then what about you? How do you take care of yourself after that situation and you were cool and you were methodical and all the best practices, but you go for a walk? What do you do, Chris? How do we get rid of that stress?
Energy has to go somewhere, right?
Yes.
So typically it's going to be physical exercise. It's going to be just taking a moment to breathe. The power and importance of breathing is something that I've always undervalued, but of course preached to others. Even taking a moment to stretch and just kind of step away from the situation. There are very few instances that are of such urgency that you can't take a little bit of time to just power down and breathe for a minute and give yourself a little bit of grace. And so that's easy for me to say on the podcast here on a spring afternoon, but it's hard to do when you're inside of a pretty tenuous or tough situation. And so I think just giving yourself permission to recognize that we're all human. Nobody is perfect, and that it's okay to just take a pause from time to time is what I've had to teach myself to do. It's not innate in me. I'd rather go. And if you have a little bit of self-awareness, that helps.
Yeah, I think that's really key is self-awareness. I know about myself when I get revved up about a situation, whether it's, stressful bad or the stress is actually good. I'm very excited. I'm in flow. I'm moving fast. Sometimes it's hard to come down and wind down from that. And here come the kids, right? Or my husband wants to chat about something. So transitioning for me, and I think for a lot of us who are working in a home office, especially for those who are new and they use their drive time to kind of wind down and transition their mindset, and spaces can be different. But I definitely try to take my upset or extra energy or adrenaline out on the elliptical rather than the family members around me.
Yep.
And my dog has loved the pandemic because we've walked and walked and walked. And just sometimes that change of environment, just step outside. Look how big the trees are today. That can really do something for you in a moment of heat. So I want to share that with everyone for sure.
I remembered one other piece of advice I got through the years. An individual who was coaching me said, just put little Chris on your shoulder and determine when big Chris needs to talk or little Chris needs to just shut up and or not say much. And put yourself am I in a little Chris situation or am I in a big Chris situation? And that really helped me. When you're on the agency side, you're compensated and hired to solve problems, and your opinion is of value. And you are receiving compensation for that point of view. When you're in-house as a communicator, it's not necessarily the interest of every single employee at that company in your opinion. So really studying and understanding your role, where you fit in within the organization and what permissions and authorities you have can help us all keep our emotions in check and not, if we know that much about ourselves and we know this is how I act in certain situations, then just like planning for a crisis, just plan in advance for what that mindset's going to be when some of those situations come upon.
Perfect. Yeah, the mindset's really, really key. I've seen that very clear this last 12 months for sure. So I ask all my guests this question. Since you're my first guest, I get to ask you first. I like this idea of smart talk, getting to the real of things. But what does smart talk mean to you, Chris Talley?
Informed, wise, experience-driven, and probably succinct. Like, let's get to the point. That's how I like to write. That's how I like to edit. I've already kicked myself a few times during our visit here for over answering a few questions. And so I think that conciseness is critical, and make your point and get out.
Absolutely. That's right up my alley. Concise, clear, make it matter, get out of there. Perfect. So, Chris, I've enjoyed having you today. What's the best way for our listeners to learn more about you or your work?
Chris Talley, #1 on LinkedIn is probably the simplest way, and very involved in the San Antonio community and helping the students that we talked about across the country, and from time to time do some consulting at Talley Communication Strategies. So, but everything you need to know is right there on good old LinkedIn.
Love it. Thank you. Thanks again, Chris, for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Awesome. Thanks, MVW. Congrats on the podcast.
And thanks to our listeners for checking us out. As always, think smart and communicate smart. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Smart Talk series. If you learned something or enjoyed our conversation, share it on social media or send to a friend. To learn more about this and other communication topics, visit mvw360.com. That's mvw360.com.